And with that being said, I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Professor Tiya Miles. Her essay is The First and the Forced, Tracing Historical Overlaps in Native and Black America. Professor Miles, we were delighted to find out we've actually had a very rich and deep friendship, never having met, because she was actually on my show a number of times at Tell Me More. And she's a professor at the University of Michigan in the Department of American Culture, the Department of Afro-American and African Studies, the Department of History, the Department of Women's Studies, and Native American Studies. I think that's called intersectionality. Her research interests include African American and Native American intersectional and comparative histories and narratives, especially in the 19th century, as well as slavery, public history, and the historical experiences of women of color. She has many, many books and many awards, including being a John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation Fellow. And with that being said, Professor Tiya Miles, please welcome her.
Michelle. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for being here this afternoon. All right. I would like to begin by just setting the tone of my comments with the words of an important foreparent in African American history, and I'll let you read them. The focus of our panel this afternoon is on finding common ground between African American and Native American histories and lives. And I think the metaphor of our panel's title is especially apt because we're talking about relationships rooted in place and rooted in land. And land was the major reason why Indigenous Americans and African people, who are of course indigenous to their own homelands, were dispossessed, uprooted, and brought together in large numbers here in the place that we now call the United States. The convergence of these groups' histories was propelled by the European transformation of the 1490s through the 1800s, through which Africa was pillaged of people and America was settled by European explorers, missionaries, merchants, colonists, and enslaved Africans. The historian Sven Beckert describes this insatiable hunger on the part of Europeans for profit that was backed by violence, war capitalism. And he says that war capitalism was a process by which, quote, fresh lands and new labor created a new economic order. Those fresh lands were taken from Native Americans. That new labor was stolen from both Native and African peoples. And so together, these groups, against their will, made up the groundwork, the literal groundwork of the American nation. In the midst of this misuse and hardship, Indigenous Americans and African people developed complex ties with one another and became essential to America's success as a country. Their descendants survived attempts at dehumanization, social death, and in some places, genocide, to continue building families, communities, and indigenous nations. This drawing by the Lakota artist Francis Yellow is one that I find evocative for our topic because it characterizes the movement of African and Indigenous American people across space, across oceans, to find a common ground. This is the title that he has given to the piece, Beautiful Words. First they made prayers, and they sang and they danced, and then they made relatives. And I find this image and also the poetic words connected to it uplifting when we think about what is a really painful history. Much was taken, but all was not lost. So there are many surprising and compelling stories that emerge from the conjoined histories of African America and Native America, and we'll only be able to scratch the surface here. We're going to do a little bit of historical context, that's my role, and then talk about the present and future circumstances. So I'm going to focus on two key moments, one being slavery, and I'll talk mostly about slavery, and the second being schooling. And I'll look at the enslavement of both Native Americans and African Americans. In addition to that, the enslavement of Black people by Native Americans, enslaved African Americans who ran away to Native American communities, and Black people who experienced the Trail of Tears. And then I'll look at schooling toward the end of my presentation and focus on the Indian program at Hampton Institute. I hope that exploring these moments will demonstrate that Native Americans and African Americans matter to one another, for better, and if we are honest, sometimes for worse. And in addition, the braided nature of these groups' position in American history mattered to the origins, growth, and staying power of the United States, the very nation that authorized their subjugation as racialized populations. At the center of my talk, behind my comments, is the implicit question, what is at stake when marginalized peoples come into contact with one another, often forming relational ties across generations in the compromising context of pain and loss? So, slavery. Without a fertile land base and free labor to work it, the United States would not have developed into a prosperous nation, and indeed an empire. One fact about slavery in this country that I think we are slowly coming to in mainstream awareness, in mainstream society, is that Native people were enslaved first. They were enslaved in large numbers. They were enslaved by the tens of thousands, and they were enslaved for approximately 150 years in tandem with African people. A number of historians have looked at this, including J. Leach Wright, Alan Gallay, Christina Snyder, and Margaret Newell. And just looking at the English colonies alone, they have counted, and actually who claim themselves to be conservative in this count, but they have counted tens of thousands, approximately 30 to 50,000 enslaved Native people who were held by the English and the British. We know from scholarship about the Spanish colonies that Spanish people enslaved many Native Americans as well. So even as an African diaspora was being formed through the dispersal of enslaved Blacks across the Atlantic Ocean, an American diaspora, in the words of anthropologist Jack Forbes, was being formed through the enslavement and dispersal of Native Americans. Many of these Native captives were traded to the Caribbean and traded to Europe. Some were sold to New England and to the Upper South. And the urban center of Charlestown, South Carolina, was the main place for the trade and sale of both Black people and Native people into slavery. Black people and Native people stood on the same auction blocks, traveled across the Atlantic on the same ships, and finally ended up in the same urban households or rural plantations. The shared circumstances of their enslavement led to the intersection of Black and Native lives in terms of family formation and also cultural exchange. The historian Peter Wood observed in his classic study of early South Carolina that, quote, during the proprietary era, several thousand Indian slaves still shared the same tasks and the same quarters with Africans from overseas. Now, this merger took place in the North as well as in the South, but in the North, dynamics were a little bit different. The historian Daniel Mandel has investigated what he finds to be a demographic pattern in New England in which European enslavers wanted to buy African men, and Native men were decreasing in number due to wars and also their need to be mobile to join the workforce. So this meant that in New England, African men who were enslaved were forming relationships with Native American women who who were often indentured servants in New England households. Examples of Black and Native couplings have been documented across regions, especially in the Southeast and the Northeast, but many of these relationships actually cannot be proven via written records. Although interracial intimacy continued within the enslaved population, enslaved Indians became less visible over time, especially as they intermarried with African Americans, and their enslavers wrote them down under the category Negro. Enslaved Native people became lost in the historical record. Now, at the same time that Black and Native people were being enslaved, oftentimes in the same locations, enslaved African Americans were escaping to free Native communities and towns. And they may have done this in small numbers, but they did it in a way that is noteworthy and important. Many colonial newspapers include escaped slave advertisements with owners trying to get their human property back, where there's an indication that those owners realize that the Black person who has run away has friends or relatives in the Indian country, and that represents a threat to English society, the possibility that Native people and Black people might join forces to actually fight against slavery. Now, Black people who escaped their owners and made their way into Native communities weren't necessarily automatically accepted into that community. They were strangers and they were foreigners, just like anybody else would be who was not known. They had to build links and build ties to communities in order to be accepted. And in some cases that happened, in other cases that did not happen. The strongest way for African people to form ties was to intermarry, to be adopted, or to serve an important economic function such as trading with Native people. The historian James Merrill found two interesting examples in the Catawba Nation of the Carolinas. And in the primary sources he looked at, there were African American men who were described in the same time period in very different ways. One man, described as a, quote, a Negro fellow, tried to trade with the Catawbas, but he was met with anger and refusal in the 1750s. But another man, described as a, quote, free Negro among the Catawbas, was received by Catawba people. He spoke their language, and he knew their language as well as English. So, same location, same time period, same Native nation, two different Black men treated differently because they were individuals, and in this period, race was not the key factor for determining how a relationship should develop, or if a relationship should develop. Native people instead determined how they would relate to Black people on a case-by-case basis, depending on circumstance, cultural dictates, and mutual needs. And Black people seeking free spaces and better lives would also have assessed the Native people they encountered with discernment on a one-on-one kind of basis. By the mid to late 1700s, the enslavement of Native Americans was fading in the United States, and that was due to Enlightenment thought, ideas about the noble savage, and the rhetoric of the American Revolution. At the same time that Native slavery was falling out of favor, the importation of African slaves was increasing, and an ideology of racial difference was beginning to take stronger hold. This ideology began to affect southeastern Native nations who began to own Black people as their property. Many, but not all, Native slave owners in the South were the children of Native women and European or white American men. So many of them were mixed race, but not all of them were mixed race. These men, most of them were men, tended to be political leaders in their Native societies. And they were working hard to comply with US government dictates that told Native people that in order to be protected and secure in their land base, they had to prove their level of, quote, civilization. When the US defined civilization, it made no secret of the fact that it included capitalism as a part of that, working and accruing wealth, and that it believed slavery was a good way to achieve capitalist success. So some Native Southerners began to rely on enslaved Black labor, not just for the labor, but to demonstrate this degree of, quote, civilization to U.S. authorities. This was a survival strategy that aimed to prove Native rights to land and self-government. But the strategy came at a great cost to Black human rights, as well as to Native traditional kinship practices, which had previously not made decisions about who belonged and who didn't based upon race or skin color. But even in this context of Native slave ownership, close relations did persist. Intimate ties continued between Black and Native people, though we must acknowledge that some of these were in the context of coercion. Some Native male slaveholders did coerce enslaved African American women into sexual relationships. At the same time, there were some freely chosen relationships, even across the line of slaveholder and enslaved person. There's one story in the Federal Writers Project, Ex-Slave Narratives, in which a Cherokee woman says that she married a Black man who was formerly this enslaved person of her family. So in Native America, these lines were a little more flexible than what we would think of in Southern white America. And also at this time, Black people continued to escape and to run away to Native spaces, especially to the Seminole Nation of Florida. Soon after this colonial period, there was a major turn in U.S. Native relations, and this was the period of Indian removal. And I'll repeat what you heard in the introduction and say that there's a new exhibit upstairs that presents removal in a really compelling way and shows just how long the process was, just how expensive the process was, and just how wrong-headed the process was. But President Andrew Jackson was intent upon Indian removal, intent upon forcing Native people east of the Mississippi out of their homelands and into the West since before he took office. He thought that this policy was, quote, these are his words, not only liberal, but generous, end quote. The historian Mary Hirschberger has observed that slavery played a role in the successful passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830, since the 3/5 clause of the U.S. Constitution increased the voting power of Southern whites who craved Indian land. So the Indian removal period did more than open Southern and Midwestern lands to white settlement. In the South, the ouster of Native people cleared fertile land for an expanding plantation economy that would run on slave labor and produce the lucrative Cotton Kingdom. American Indian land and now Black labor were tightly interlocked in this 19th century moment of U.S. expansion. Now, we've already talked about how some Native people, a minority of Native people in the South, owned Black people as property. And this means that Indian removal, and especially, I think the most storied experience of Indian removal, the Cherokee Trail of Tears, included African Americans. In the Cherokee Nation, approximately 1,652 Black people were enslaved just prior to removal. They made up about 1/10 of the Cherokee population at the time. And many of them also walked the Trail of Tears. Former Cherokee Principal Chief Willa Mankiller talked about the import of this fact in her memoir. She wrote, "It should be remembered that hundreds of people of African ancestry also walked the Trail of Tears with the Cherokees during the forced removal of 1838 and 1839. Although we know about the terrible human suffering of our Native people and the members of the other tribes during removal, we rarely hear of those Black people who also suffered." Now, during removal, wealthy families like the Ridges and the Vans, and you saw their homes a moment ago, they emigrated first, and so they were able to choose the best of the land in Indian territory. Enslaved people who traveled with these families usually moved by way of waterways and boat. And we have a few firsthand accounts of this, again from the WPA slave narratives. A Cherokee freedwoman named Cheney McNair, who had been owned by 3 different Cherokee families in her lifetime, said this about removal. "My parents came from Georgia with the Cherokees, and they came by boat." Joseph Van's dramatic transport of blacks that he had enslaved made an impression on the memories of Oklahomans. And one interviewer wrote down impressions of people who saw him arrive and said this about how they described that moment. Quote, "It was quite a sight for the people around the falls when Joe Van's property arrived by steamboat. There were looks of astonishment and shouts of surprise as boat after boat came into view, some towing barges filled with men, women, and children. As the boats drew near the shore, the onlookers saw the barges were filled with black people, too many to count." And the Van family did hold over 100 African-descended people as their property. Blacks who were owned by Cherokees with less wealth walked the trail, and we have some firsthand accounts of their experiences as well. They had to labor during this long journey. They hunted, they nursed the sick, they prepared meals, they guarded the camps at night, and they hiked ahead to remove obstructions from the roads. One Cherokee man remembered the experience of enslaved black people on the trail, and you will hear his bias as a slaveholder in his comments. Nathaniel Willis said, "My grandparents were helped and protected by a very faithful Negro slave who went ahead of the wagons and killed any wild beast who came along." A missionary who accompanied Cherokees on the journey named Daniel Buttrick recorded in his journal incidents about enslaved black people. Buttrick said that one elderly black woman whose children had recently purchased her freedom, quote, "died in the camps." The woman's son, Peter, and his wife were then sold to slave speculators on the road. Along the trail, one black man cut some wood for the night, according to the missionary, and a black woman, referred to as our kind Nancy, was, quote, "employed to wash and dry our clothes in the evening by the fire." An unnamed black man died on a February day that also took the lives of 4 Cherokees. And Buttrick wrote, the missionary, "During this time, 5 individuals have died, viz. 1 old Cherokee woman, 1 black man, and 3 Cherokee children, making in all, since we crossed the Tennessee River, 26 deaths." So approximately 4,000 Cherokees died during this forced eviction, and the demographer Russell Thornton has argued that once we take into account the decline in the birth rate that resulted from removal, the total population lost was closer to 10,000 people. Enslaved blacks and free Afro-Cherokees were among those who lost their lives. Their numbers may have been smaller than that of the Cherokee non-black population, but their suffering was commensurate. As one former bondswoman of Cherokees said in her description of the event, and her name was Eliza Whitmire, quote, "The weeks that followed General Scott's order to remove the Cherokees were filled with horror and suffering for the unfortunate Cherokees and their slaves." After the Removal Act had been enforced, white Southerners in particular, and the American nation as a whole, benefited enormously from the suffering of Native people as well as blacks. The expulsion of Cherokees and other Indian nations cleared the way for the expansion of slavery, a variety of which far surpassed Indian slaveholding in intensity and extent. What had been a society with slaves in the Native American South, that is a place where a few people did hold others as property, but it wasn't the dominant mode of economic production. In a place that had been a society with slaves, the Native American South, we now saw a slave society in a white American South. To use a characterization of historians David and Jean Heidler, the institution of American slavery and the event of Indian removal were, in both cause and effect, twin evils. So now moving on to part 2. After the Removal Act, after the Civil War, federal officials focused on assimilating and civilizing Native people. And one way they set upon doing this was by breaking down lands that Native tribes, Native peoples held in common into individual plots. The U.S. government, U.S. officials, U.S. reformers were very focused on the idea that individualism and individually held property was key to what it meant to be, quote, civilized. So each Native person was to have a homestead on a larger 160-acre plot of land, and the common lands were to be dissolved to break up the tribal communal base. A congressional commission was designed to go about this work, led by Senator Henry Dawes. And he mandated a census to know how many Native people needed to be assigned these individual lands. The infamous Dawes rolls that came from this act in this organization categorized American Indians by blood quantum, which formally inscribed a racial definition of Indianness. The so-called excess lands that were remaining were distributed to white people, and land speculation ran rampant in Indian territory. In tandem with land allotment, the federal government encouraged and funded educational institutions that were aimed at transforming Native children into assimilated members of dominant society. The federal government favored the development of schools for Indian children that would be run by non-Indians. And the goal of these schools was to teach Native children how to be, quote, civilized or Euro-American in their beliefs and in their behaviors. They were to abandon their so-called tribal ways and assimilate into white society, but actually on a lower rung of white society. So these schools took many forms and changed over time. Some of the earliest schools were operated by missionaries. Many of them were on or near reservations. And children weren't forced, the families weren't forced to have them attend these schools. Some Native parents elected to have their children go to these schools so that they could acquire important skills. After 1817, the U.S. government formalized support of these schools and then turned to founding and operating their own boarding schools, usually off-reservation, which were administered and run mostly by non-Native people. So Native children were plunged into a strict militarized environment that differed drastically from their home communities. Within this environment, they were taught that being Indian was wrong and even shameful, and that they had to change in order to be civilized, recognized members of American society. As you have, I'm sure, heard and read about in many other contexts, children in Indian boarding schools had to have their hair cut, they were forbidden to speak in their native tongues, they were often physically abused or confined, they had to wear clothing that was uncomfortable to them, and they were denied the familial affections of home. They were also told that their people's life ways were backward and savage. So there was a psychological and emotional aspect to their schooling, as well as a physical aspect to their schooling, an educational aspect. These are photographs that were taken at Hampton, and I just want to point out to you, we often see this kind of pairing on the left and the right of Native students when they first arrive at a boarding school, and Native students after they have been, quote, transformed into civilized members of the institution. In these photographs, the artist Carrie Mae Weems actually has written some commentary over older pictures taken at Hampton. So we see the photographs and we see her interpretation on the top. So obviously she has a critical view of what missionary education might mean for Native people, that the so-called hand of grace was actually detrimental, and it was dividing Native children, Native people from themselves. So this was, again, another difficult context. But within this time and within this context, Native people and African Americans came together again for a sustained period of time and in large numbers. In the Reconstruction South, in the 1860s and 1870s, a series of schools were being developed to educate recently emancipated African Americans in basic academic subjects and in a range of applied, kind of hands-on skills that depended on their gender. So boys were supposed to be doing outside physical work, girls doing domestic work. Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute in Virginia was the first fully developed Black industrial school. And it became a biracial institution and an early site of government-funded education for American Indians. Now, Samuel Chapman Armstrong was the founder of Hampton. He was a white man. He was the son of American missionaries in Hawaii. And he viewed African Americans as inferior, but he believed for his own religious reasons that they should be freed and that they should be helped. Armstrong wrote to a friend in 1862, quote, "I am sort of an abolitionist, but I have not learned to love the Negro," end quote. Armstrong felt that Black people's best quality was their steady habit of labor that they had acquired during slavery, and he felt that hard work could refine their moral character. While serving as an agent for the Freedmen's Bureau in Hampton, Virginia, Armstrong thought of the idea of developing a Black school to train teachers. He applied for missionary funds and founded Hampton in 1868. Students at Hampton did a good deal of physical manual labor. They spent at least 2 10-hour days per week and up to 6 10-hour days per week performing manual labor. The goal for Hampton faculty was to teach students how to work steadily and regularly, how to attend promptly at certain hours to certain duties, and how to gain ideas about the value of manual labor. So Hampton was an institution that was meant to teach African Americans how to fit into their subordinate place in white society, rather than how to equalize race relations or transform society. Now, Armstrong accepted Indian students at Hampton in large part because he was interested in the increased funding that an Indian program could bring to the school. His personal letters reveal as much of a bias against Native people as his bias against Black people. He described Black people as darkies and Native people as savages. Native Americans first entered Hampton in 1878, 10 years after the school's founding. And the first students were brought there by Captain Richard Henry Pratt, who was infamous for his motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man." After spending time at Hampton, Pratt would go on to develop the well-known Carlisle Indian School. But Pratt transported prisoners of war from Plains Indian nations to Hampton to study, especially manual labor, under the directorship of Armstrong. And like for Blacks, the focus of educating Native students at Hampton was on their uplift as it pertained to industrial training. Native people were supposed to learn the habits of white society that would enable their eventual assimilation. When Hampton first launched its Indian program, Native students studied alongside African Americans in the same classrooms. And this is a picture of one of those classrooms. There are Native students and Black students in the room. This is a history class. And there's a Native man there who, this is a very interesting photograph. He's really on display, talking about, quote, history, in a way that we might view as being a stereotypical representation of what Armstrong might define as a, quote, wild, uncivilized Indian. So students were studying together. They did live in a semi-segregated environment, though. Their dorms were race-based. And they were actually encouraged to compete and to compare each other along racial lines. School administrators imagined Black students as willing workers because of the legacy of slavery, while they pictured Indians as wild, proud, and hostile. So Black students were expected to teach their Indian peers good cheer and enthusiasm for labor. And Indians were expected to teach their Black peers self-confidence and self-restraint. Black students were actually placed on a higher scale of civilization by officials at the school. And this was a marked difference from the ways in which Black people figured into a scale during Southern Native slave ownership. In that context, Black people were at the bottom of the scale. But in the Hampton context, Black people were above Native people on the scale, but still, of course, lower than whites. African American teachers at the school actually reinforced this racial hierarchy. Booker T. Washington headed the Indian program at Hampton before he founded Tuskegee and took many of those ideas with him. A woman named Georgiana Washington was a graduate of Hampton. She was a Black woman, and she became the assistant in the Indian girls' dorm. Georgiana Washington recalled the scene of the first Native students' arrival, and you will hear the bias in her words, just like you heard bias in the words of that Cherokee slaveholder that I read to you earlier. Georgiana Washington said, quote, "The party of Indians were dressed in blankets and moccasins and had their faces painted. A bath and change to citizens' dress was first in order. They were put in rooms with the colored students in order to learn English and the ways of civilized life," end quote. Georgiana Washington trained Native girls in the skills and virtues of domestic labor. And she said in an account of her experience that while these pupils had at first shown no interest in proper housekeeping, quote, "they now enjoy a neat home as much as any other people." The Hampton program ended in 1922 due to a number of reasons, including and especially the loss of congressional support. There are many ways that scholars look at Indian boarding schools. There was a good deal of harm done, but also there were benefits. And one of those benefits that graduates wrote about at the time, and scholars like Brenda Child have been writing about in recent years, is Native children, Native students, got to meet others across tribal lines, and at Hampton, across racial lines. And many of those students actually became teachers and activists in their communities. As the first enforced Americans, Indigenous and African-descended people have time traveled together, contending with forces of radical change, suffering traumas of displacement and violence, and shaping short and long-term survival strategies. Their histories have touched in significant ways that colored their group and individual experiences, impacted the development of the United States as a nation, and continue to influence contemporary life experiences. Recognition of their linked past is one way to begin imagining radical possibilities for the future. Thank you for your attention.
Those sparks you may have seen were my mind being blown